Software developers succeed by combining technical ability, communication skills, and well-reasoned philosophies in order to craft information systems. Where this podcast focuses on information systems, Developer on Fire focuses on the engineers who build those systems. Dave Rael started his podcast as a way to overcome fear and access an entrepreneurial side of himself. In his interviews with prominent engineers, Dave identifies patterns and strategies that have enabled his guests to succeed. He also finds the human side, namely the fallibilities and the failures of legendary developers. And this makes it easier to imagine ourselves accomplishing the feats of his developer guests. I really enjoyed this conversation with Dave Rael, and if you like Software Engineering Daily, you will also like Developer on Fire, and I hope you check out that podcast. Incapsula is a cloud service that protects applications from attackers and improves performance. Incapsula sits between customer requests and your servers, and it filters traffic, preventing it from ever reaching your servers. Botnets and denial of service attacks are recognized by Incapsula and blocked. This protects your API servers and your microservices from responding to unwanted requests. To try Incapsula, go to incapsula.com/sedaily and get a month free for Software Engineering Daily listeners. Incapsula's API gives you control over the security and performance of your application, whether you have a complex microservices architecture or a WordPress site. Incapsula has a global network of 30 data centers that optimize routing and cache your content. The same network of data centers that are filtering your content for attackers are operating as a CDN and speeding up your application. To try Incapsula today, go to incapsula.com/sedaily and check it out. Thanks to Incapsula for being a new sponsor of Software Engineering Daily. Dave Rael is the host of Developer on Fire. Dave, welcome to Software Engineering Daily.
Well, thanks very much, Jeff. Glad to be here.
So Developer on Fire is a podcast where you interview developers about their stories, and what I think is differentiating about Developer on Fire is that the focus is on who the guest is. And on most software engineering podcasts, the guest is appearing to talk about the technology that they are an expert in. Your show is more about the human element. Why did you take that approach?
Well, you nailed it right on the head. That's exactly what I intend, is that, I've heard a lot of developer podcasts, obviously. I'm very much a consumer in addition to being a creator. And, when I decided that I wanted to create a podcast, I didn't want to be just another guy doing the same thing as everybody else. And it took a long time before I finally landed on that featuring developers rather than development topics was the thing for me. It was kind of, it was an accident that I stumbled on the idea. I heard a podcast, an entrepreneur podcast, which I'm not really, well, I guess I'm trying to become an entrepreneur, much like you have become with SE Daily, right? But I didn't really intend to be an entrepreneur. I just stumbled across an entrepreneur podcast called Entrepreneur on Fire, right? Very creative in my title, coming from that. But I heard that podcast. I heard a developer on that podcast. Well, I heard this developer, Trevor Page, on another podcast, and he became this entrepreneur with selling his I will teach you Java programming things. And when I heard this guy, I was just like, he's great. I want to find out more about him. And when I Googled his name, the first thing that came up was Entrepreneur on Fire. So I listened to his interview on that show. And then, on the website, I noticed, hey, Tim Ferriss and some other names that I recognized. And so I listened to a few of those. And it wasn't immediately that the idea dawned on me that Developer on Fire should kind of take the same form as Entrepreneur on Fire. But that was the inspiration, was hearing, hey, this guy is featuring entrepreneurs and, of course, talking about entrepreneurial things, but more getting them to tell stories, share their experiences. And the topic was not some entrepreneurial topic, but it was the entrepreneur themselves. And I said, you know what? Actually, probably about a year and a half later, I decided, that's what developers need. That's the thing that's not out there in existing podcasts. And so that was my motivation, that, hey, I want to talk about developers rather than development.
this makes the conversation really meta because Software Engineering Daily was basically started because I was part of Software Engineering Radio, and I completely cribbed the name and I stole the format basically because I was like, well, this format's really successful. I think I should just copy it and do it like 5 times a week. And I've been totally shameless and open about how I copied that format and kind of expanded on it. And the format has changed over time, certainly. But I think it's interesting, that model, because I think one of the lessons there is that like the podcasting is still a very nascent format, and people who want to start podcasts, you really can just like take a format that you like and copy it and expand on it and have a fairly successful format. I mean, Developer on Fire is a really good spin on what Entrepreneur on Fire was, as opposed to my model of kind of just copying and making it more frequent. Have you spoken to the John Lee Dumas? That's the guy who runs Entrepreneur on Fire?
Via email, yes. In fact, when I decided that I wanted to, and I've mentioned this in a couple places on Developer on Fire and elsewhere, that I emailed John Lee Dumas about, hey, here's my idea. I want to shamelessly rip off of your format and apply it to another place. And is that okay with you, right? do you object to me doing that? And his response was an enthusiastic, booyah. If you've listened to his show, you know what his personality is like, and he was exactly in email the way he is on the show. It was a very enthusiastic, yes, you have my blessing, go for it.
Yeah, he's I like his show, and he's got some really good interviews on there.
Yeah, I wondered if he was part of an influence for SE Daily as well, because the daily piece of it, right? I mean, his frequency is kind of the element in common there.
Oh yes, that was part of it. That was certainly part of it. I did see, and I also read he has this post on podcast economics, like how much money you can make doing a podcast, and I looked at that, and like his numbers were not totally actually. It's funny because in the long term, actually, at this point, I think my advertising numbers have kind of asymptoted towards the type of numbers that he wrote about in that blog post, but it took some time to get there. I mean, the economics of having a daily podcast with ads are still good, and they are actually similar to what he wrote about. So, actually, I would say he was a pretty strong influence there. So that's funny. We were both influenced by him. But let's talk more about Developer on Fire. So the focus on the human element. What are the aspects of the human condition that you find yourself examining most often in these interviews with developers?
That's a good question. I might need to think about that a little bit. I think a lot of it is team dynamics, right? And learning. Obviously, with developers, learning is a big piece of the focus. So how do you approach learning, and just some of those experiences that they've had along the way? Mentorship is another thing that has really been a big part of that. That a lot of the stories and Developer on Fire, really the intent is to tell stories, right? Get people to talk about their experience so that we can all take something away from that. And a lot of those stories center on, I had this manager, or there was this coworker, or the older guy in my first job, the guy that took me under my wing, kind of a thing. There's a lot of that in a lot of the stories. So, a lot of the kind of, I found my Obi-Wan Kenobi that was going to show me the way of the Force, right? And, that was a big piece of the ongoing story, I guess, is one of the themes that I capture quite a bit.
Is there a strong difference that you notice between the people who say that mentorship component was important for them, and then the people who do not mention mentorship, maybe the people who are more self-taught?
I guess I don't know that there's any real pattern that I've noticed. I think there is a lot of that. And really, I guess they're not really mutually exclusive too, right? A lot of people stumble onto software and teach themselves some of the basics and then get into a job, and then it's more of a career mentorship or something along those lines. So I don't know, those axes are not necessarily orthogonal. But I guess there's probably elements of both sides of those in everybody's story, because if you don't have the drive, the self-motivation to teach yourself something and to learn on your own, then that's pretty career limiting, and it limits what you're able to do in software, certainly.
What about from a technical perspective? What are the kinds of advice that people talk about when they come on Developer on Fire. Certainly the mentorship thing applies to being a developer and evolving as a developer, but that's more broadly applicable to, I think, career. I think anybody in any type of career, whether you're a salesperson or anything, you have to learn. Mentorship is great, but are there technical pieces of advice that people have said or invoked in their stories that you've seen as themes, or have even just from one person that has stood out?
Well, there's certainly usually going to be some element of technical, right? I mean, you can't have two developers talking to each other without it winding up on something technical or related to technical eventually. So there's certainly been a lot of that to varying degrees. And, I think it probably gets a little bit more technical. Developer on Fire is very technology stack language agnostic, right? I've had guests from all sorts of different backgrounds. So when I have guests who have a little more in common with me, as far as I've been primarily using C# for a majority of my career and .NET. So when there's an overlap on that technical, I think there might be a tendency to get a little more technical. I haven't actually done a look at the numbers to find out if that's the case, but I expect it is, and I feel like we've probably talked a little bit more about technology when we have more common ground. But I guess some of the things, a focus on testing and test-driven development, I guess, is one of the things that has emerged as being something that has been mentioned quite a bit. Really web technologies too, just JavaScript, kind of runs through everything. So kind of, getting some perspectives on different approaches, different frameworks in JavaScript. I guess those are some of the technical things that have come up a little bit as well.
This seems like a good place to shift to a discussion of engineering, because you describe yourself as someone who spends your time building distributed systems. I read that on your bio. I love talking about distributed systems, and in a certain light, we are all distributed systems engineers today, because we're all building stuff for the web, and the web is like the biggest distributed system. It's a big distributed system. So why do you emphasize the distributed systems aspect?
Well, I think that is probably the thing that's been most interesting about the problems that I've tackled in my career. At the risk of starting a holy war, right? I mean, there are a lot of interesting problems in user interface and using, different web components to make your web pages come alive, and different JavaScript frameworks and all of the things that you can do there. And interesting problems, right? There's so many different things going on when you're dealing with user input. But that's not the thing that has really fired me up over the course of my career. That's not the place where I've derived the most joy. The biggest things to me are fault tolerance and that kind of interesting stuff, and using message queuing to be able to handle some of those situations where the thing on the other end isn't available in the moment, and how can I handle taking this request and doing something with it, even in the case of the inevitable faults that are going to happen in systems and downtimes and outages. Some of the biggest pains that I've ever had in my career were, it's always related to the one big monolithic database. And so to me, and I found an influence at kind of the right point in my career, I think, where I kind of determined that this was something worth thinking about more. I went to a course. Udi Dahan has an advanced distributed systems design course, and I got to go to New York and go to his class that he was giving there.
He's the guy who created the Mirage OS, right?
No, I'm not familiar with Mirage OS. He's N-Service Bus is the flagship product.
N-Service Bus. That's right. I'm sorry. Yeah. I'm sorry to interrupt you, but because I remember hearing an episode on Software Engineering Radio that was an interview with him, and I couldn't remember which one it was, but I think it was the one on event sourcing. He may have talked about event sourcing. He's typically, positions change over time, and depending on how you define event sourcing. He was, Greg Young was kind of the real event sourcing guy. They together are kind of seen as the authorities on command query responsibility segregation, CQRS, and Udi was kind of the dissenting voice on a lot of the event sourcing stuff that has come around. But I do remember him being on SE Radio. I don't remember if that's
that's exactly what he was talking about.
Yes. So anyway, I'm sorry I interrupted you. So go ahead. What was influential about the course that you took from him?
So he begins the course with an emphasis on the fallacies of distributed computing, and the idea that the statements that the network is reliable and that latency is negligible and all of those kinds of things. That when you are planning out a system, if you don't take into account the fact that those assumptions are not true, then you run into all sorts of problems later. So his course is really 5 days of breaking down the mentality of seeing that you're going to be able to depend on the service on the other end of the wire. And so it's really a big emphasis on planning for the eventual failures that you're going to encounter. And that to me is one of the most interesting problems in computing, and kind of the thing that has that in my former job, I worked at one place for 9 years, and that was where I kind of grew up through the ranks from being kind of a young programmer into a senior engineer, and ultimately I got the title of architect, which we could probably talk all day about what that means and whether architects are necessary and all that stuff. But having the gamut of experiences there and experiencing all of those failures and having the one database that was the bottleneck for everything, having a distributed system where fault tolerance is something that can be achieved, and taking into account the CAP theorem and all of that kind of stuff that is really interesting and challenging stuff. And so really resilience in the face of failure is why I think distributed systems are so interesting.
Couchbase is a NoSQL database that powers digital businesses. Developers around the world choose Couchbase for its advantages in data model flexibility, elastic scalability, performance, and 24/365 availability to build enterprise web, mobile, and IoT applications. The Couchbase platform includes Couchbase, Couchbase Lite, which is the first mobile NoSQL database, and Couchbase Sync Gateway. Couchbase is designed for global deployments, with configurable cross-data center replication to increase data locality and availability. Running Couchbase in containers on Docker, Kubernetes, Mesos, or Red Hat OpenShift is easy, and at developer.couchbase.com you can find tutorials on how to build out your Couchbase deployment. All Couchbase products are open source projects. Couchbase customers include industry leaders like AOL, Amadeus, AT&T, Cisco, Comcast, Concur, Disney, Dixons, eBay, General Electric, Marriott, Neiman Marcus, PayPal, Ryanair, Rakuten/Vibber, Tesco, Verizon, Wells Fargo, as well as hundreds of other household names. Thanks to Couchbase for being a new sponsor of Software Engineering Daily. We really appreciate it. Distributed systems are all about being able to deal with anything failing. It's almost like a bleak perspective on how life is, but it's also kind of comforting because even in this world of totally random failure, where anything can fail at any time, you can still build successful systems. And I remember... So my first exposure to distributed systems was in this academic context where I ended up getting a C in this distributed systems class in college. And this was like senior year where I needed to pass it to graduate. And I was terrified the entire time because the class was so hard. Not only was the class itself hard, but it was sort of like introducing you to this idea that life involves random failure, and that's like existentially kind of terrifying. It was funny because the distributed systems professor rode a motorcycle, and I was always like, how can you ride a motorcycle if you're a distributed systems professor? Because like if you're riding a motorcycle and you simultaneously are teaching a class on the philosophy that random failures occur, I mean, riding a motorcycle exposes you to a little more risk of the random failures. But it was kind of an interesting life statement I think he made by riding the motorcycle, because I think he was just like, well, you can't get around failure. and sometimes you get in a motorcycle accident and you die maybe, but there's no getting around it. And so this class was all about proofs and reading papers, and it was a really difficult process. But at the end of it, finding that we can deal with this world of non-determinism, I found that somewhat comforting. I mean, did you have a similar experience where at first you were like, oh my gosh, this non-determinism is terrifying, and then over time you realize there are ways to deal with it, and that's comforting? Or did you have a different evolution?
Yeah, I think that's exactly it, right? I mean, I was probably 5 to 8 years, I guess, into my career when I finally got to attend that class with Udi, and that was half a decade of experiencing failure firsthand, right? The effort and futility of trying to make everything reliable so that your system would be reliable, right? All of those dependencies, I have to have everything in place, everything's up all the time in order for my system to be up, and just fighting that constant battle of keeping everything up. It was really a breath of fresh air to see this perspective where, you know what, that thing can go down and that's okay, right? And that was really, to me, very eye-opening, and really it's a philosophy on life as well, right? That I can let something fall apart, right? I can let one piece of something. Not everything has to be a success in order for my long-term life to be a success. I guess that's one of the things on Developer on Fire too. One of the stories I really emphasize is that I want to get guests to tell a story of failure, because we've all got those in our history, and I think it's really illuminating that those things can happen, and yet we still have this successful career arc. So yeah, I think it really is a pretty good analogy for life as well.
Before getting into computer science, you studied physics, and the field of distributed systems was essentially started by Leslie Lamport, who was deeply influenced by physics. How does your physics background affect how you think about distributed systems and computer science problems?
It's a good question. I'm not completely sure that it does. Not something I've really thought about before. I think physics was a bit of a default for me when I was in college, right? I knew that I loved physics in high school, and that was a big part of why I wanted to go into some sort of engineering-related thing, and why I went to Colorado School of Mines. A big piece of that was because I had a physics teacher in high school who was just dynamite, just an absolutely inspiring person, and he was the guy that had his computer running for weeks on end doing some calculation and some of those things, and everything about him was just learning and philosophy, in addition to just being pure science, and just a neat guy. So because of his inspiration, when I got to college and it was time to pick a major and I didn't really know what I wanted, it was kind of the default was, well, I'll declare physics for now and then decide what it's going to be later, and eventually wound up just completing the program in physics. Funny that I never realized, well, I mean, I did realize that my favorite thing in all of, both my physics classes and my electrical engineering minor classes was when I'd control a motor using some C code or something along those lines, right? The orbital motion simulations that we'd do for some of the physics classes that I'd write in QBasic, those were a blast. I really liked writing software, and, the Fortran class was great, and then taking a C++ class, I really enjoyed those things. But I guess back to the question, physics, does that really, I think, maybe more than anything, having some knowledge of some of the history of physics and some of the scientific method and some of those things, I think, not necessarily that I'm explicitly applying the scientific method to everything that I do, but being conversant, I guess, in what it means to be a scientist, I suppose does lead me into a bit more of a let's come up with a hypothesis and think about how this thing might work, and then construct some form of test to verify or to blow apart that assumption.
Now, the real world is increasingly colliding with this world of computer science, and you talk about controlling a motor with a piece of computer code. The examples we have today are things like self-driving cars and drones, and we have this giant range of hardware that falls under the umbrella of the Internet of Things. So, as this frontier of computer science overlaps with the real world more and more, and the idea of controlling a motor with some C code seems like trivial compared to the amount of leverage that we're going to have in the very near future when we can write a quick request to have a drone fly across a state and pick something up. And do you think it places more emphasis on a computer scientist to understand the physical properties of the world, like how to translate how physics translates through computer science into affecting the real world? Or do you think that the physical considerations, the physics and the mathematics associated there are just totally going to be abstracted from the average developer? We'll just be making an API call for a drone to visit a physical location, and we won't actually care about the physics because somebody else will be taking care of that for us?
Well, I think that's exactly it, is that there are different levels of abstraction, right? And in order for that drone to be able to have those APIs where you can just call it and move it and those things, somebody had to do the low-level programming to turn the motors that are turning the propellers that are keeping that afloat and getting all of that, right? So, yeah, different levels. And there are computer scientists that are going to have to deal with all of those sorts of things. It becomes a bit of a question, right? Do computer scientists need to know more about the real world? Well, it's really the age-old question in software engineering, not necessarily computer science, but software engineering, of how deeply do you need to know your domain in order to be an effective programmer in creating the systems around that business, that domain, that thing it is that you're doing. That's where I think Eric Evans really comes in. And speaking of software engineering radio, right? The 10 years after the book episode with Eric Evans, I think, was epic, and I absolutely, that was my favorite episode of, well, I mean, perhaps other than Linda Rising, who was wonderful anywhere, of SE Radio. But I keep recommending to people, listen to that, because there's so much wisdom that obviously in the book from Evans, but all of the things that he said since then about emphases and some of that stuff. But knowing your domain, right, getting into just what is it that this software is doing. Among that would be the physical manifestation of controlling something in the real world, in addition to just being some web interface. And I say just some web interface, like that's trivial, which obviously that's not the case. But knowing about the domain, the thing it is that the problem that you're trying to solve, I think that's critical to going from being a code monkey to a software engineer, or whatever title it is that you want to put on the thing, to really be an effective problem solver, a collaborator with your domain experts. Well, then you've got to get in there and understand what their world is like.
Let's shift back to talking about podcasting. Who are the interviewers and the podcasters that you have taken the most cues from, and what have you learned from them?
Wow, that's interesting to think about. I think about those things, but not really explicitly. So the first podcast that I ever listened to was .NET Rocks. Carl Franklin and Richard Campbell are I'd say, to me, probably just because of having the early exposure, right? I think Carl was putting audio on the internet before anybody ever thought of the term podcast. And I talked to Carl and Richard at a conference once, and they were kind of talking about, well, is .NET Rocks the oldest podcast in the world, right? The one going the furthest back. And I think there's like one or two others that might have a claim for it, depending on how you define podcast and some of those things. But it's at least able to claim being one of the longest running podcasts ever. So I think really both of those guys are exceptional, both from a standpoint of being software professionals, but also experienced interviewers and really personable and good at things. And I've said it in a few places before, I think there are two people in the world that I would count as the most intelligent person I've ever met, that there would be a competition between those two, and Richard Campbell is among those, because he can speak intelligently on any subject, and it's really impressive. Wow. So I think those guys are certainly influences and a source of why I like podcasting so much. I guess anybody in the world who listens to podcasts these days has probably come across Tim Ferriss, and I love his podcast because it's such a broad range of different disciplines of people that he talks to, but it's really with an emphasis on these are high performers. These are people who are great in their field, and let's try to get in there and figure out, what are some of the things about great people that kind of tie them together across many different disciplines.
And
he is. Go ahead.
See, he also, what I like about him is he really can step outside of the things that he's typically comfortable talking about. Like the one where I think the Tim Ferriss interview that impressed me the most was when he interviewed Glenn Beck, because he was like, here is somebody who I'm pretty sure I'm going to disagree with on a lot of things, and I think most of the listeners are going to disagree with on a lot of things, but he's somebody who has accrued a giant following, and he's kind of a weird, interesting guy. He's got a crazy background, and I'm gonna find out what makes him tick. And I was like, that is just cool that you are not afraid of alienating some of your audience.
Yeah, I love that too, and honestly, that's a fear that has paralyzed me. On having an audience on Developer on Fire is, I don't want to express controversial opinions because I feel like I'm going to torpedo my audience in some of those things, and it's kind of my inspiration for why I have this ambition to create another podcast where I talk philosophy and do talk about some of those things that where I'm going to find disagreement with a lot of people, and hopefully I can keep those worlds separated. Because I think there's still a lot to be learned from the lessons of developers and some of those things. But yeah, I think that is absolutely a great thing about Ferriss, is that he really at least seems to be pretty fearless about tackling things and going deep on the performance of individuals, including the content behind it.
So can you give us a preview for some of the controversial philosophies that you might expose in the future?
Well, I think my opinion in general, philosophically, is maximum liberty. And I think there are a lot of ramifications of that, a lot of things that people might see as being biased towards some certain things, or a lot of those things. I don't want to go much deeper than that, but I think my love of liberty is a source of some consequences that I think would land me in some hot water with a lot of people.
I love it. Well, I hope the water will heat up and you'll get your own podcast, or get a separate podcast for that at some point. I feel similarly. There are things. I've done some shows about philosophy. Like sometimes on a Saturday, I'll release a monologue episode where I just talk about some philosophies, and it's funny because those episodes tend to be divisive, and it's like some people, and I don't run ads on them, so that's like, I don't know, maybe that's something you could do on Developer on Fire, is on an off day, just be like, hey, today is a monologue day and I'm going to talk about some stuff that you may find completely crazy, but anyway, I think as many people as it's actually, it may have alienated a very small subset of the audience, but the people who like those episodes, they gets a stronger allegiance from them, I think.
I think that makes sense. There's probably a lot of truth to that.
But okay, so talking more about the podcasters you've learned from it, and I think learning from yourself too. So one thing I love about podcasting is it forces me to scrutinize my own communication patterns. Like, I think I've already interrupted you twice, and when I look at myself under a microscope in these communication scenarios, which I have to do because I listen back to these episodes, I'm often like horrified with how I am interacting, and I'm just like, who would want to interact with somebody like this? But I think I've ironed out a lot of some of the horrible problems, the earlier problems with my communication over the episodes that I've done. I'm curious if you have a similar situation, because you do so many episodes. What are the aspects of interpersonal communication that you have improved as a podcaster?
Well, there's no question. I mean, listening to some of my early episodes compared to some of the more recent ones, it's night and day as far as what kind of host I am and how well I do the job of being a podcast host. And a part of that is my interpersonal communication skills. I think that has grown quite a bit. I never even realized before I started doing the podcast and listening back to myself that I have a bit of a stutter, right? I sometimes do kind of an I kind of a thing, and I didn't never even noticed that for all of my life until I started listening to it. I'm like, oh my gosh, who is that guy, right? And I think I've gotten better at that, but it hasn't gone away. But it is a lot less. I use less ums and uhs than I used to, but that hasn't gone away either. And I haven't really made a conscious effort to try to change those things. I think probably the biggest change in me is confidence, right? I mean, I feel now, I've told many times in the context of Developer on Fire and other things that my story for a majority of my life was that I'm good at machines, but I'm not good at humans. And that's held me back in a lot of ways. And Developer on Fire, I think one of the big lessons that I've taken away is that that's not true. It's simply not true. I am capable of having a great conversation with another human being, connecting with them, having some empathy toward what it is that they're feeling, and getting into their story and really feeling that thing. And I think that varies obviously with the storyteller and how well they are able to convey the thing. But I think I've really just not only become a more empathetic human being, but I've realized that I am that. And I think confidence, much like everybody that is going to have a second child, that they ask me for any advice or anything like that, going into, I've been through this experience once, but now another time. Well, I tell them that, the second time is so much easier because there's just such a sense of ease. There's such a sense of that, hey, I've been here. The first time you have a baby, it is a stressful nightmare. It is it's really every little gurgle and choke. You're thinking, oh my gosh, this is the end, right? I've totally messed up, and my child is about to have some horrible fate befall them because of the terribleness of my early parenting efforts. The second time, it's I've done this before, no big deal. And I think that that confidence, right, is really in a lot of ways the difference in doing something well and not doing it well. Same lesson goes in basketball, right? And when I play basketball and I'm not playing well, that just compounds itself because I start feeling like, well, hey, maybe I'm not that good. When I start hesitating to take shots that I normally would take, well, that's an indication that I'm not playing at my best and I'm not feeling that I'm very smart. So, or not necessarily smart, but that I'm not necessarily the best person to be taking this opportunity. So confidence goes a long way, and I think that's probably the biggest difference in me as a podcast host is that now, when I have somebody on and, speaking to big name developers, right, celebrities in the field, the Uncle Bobs, the Ward Cunninghams, the DHHs, having those guys on the show, it's much more comfortable to me, and I feel like I can talk to these people, and that I'm one of them, which I think is something that it's remarkable, and it's so completely not the person that I used to be, and so I think that's probably the biggest piece of how my patterns have changed. And I guess I'm forgetting a little bit exactly how the question was phrased, but communication patterns and how I deal with people, and the confidence to ask these people, right? That I asked DHH for an interview out of the blue, not knowing him, that, all of these things that being able to reach out and ask somebody, here's what I would like from you. Are you willing to do it? And facing the potential of George McFly, right? I just don't think I could take that kind of rejection, right? What if they say no? But changing that perspective and not being that timid George McFly anymore, being the confident one that actually punched out Biff and now has the life of his dreams, right? That's a huge shift in the way that I deal with the world.
Every software project uses email. Every time an e-commerce site processes a transaction or a user makes a comment on a social network, email notifications are sent. SparkPost provides email delivery services for apps and websites. To try SparkPost and send 100,000 emails a month for free, go to pages.sparkpost.com/sedaily. SparkPost has a range of pricing options, from free self-service packages to sophisticated enterprise support and services. Start sending emails to your users today. Go to pages.sparkpost.com/sedaily to send 100,000 emails a month for free. Thanks to SparkPost for being a new sponsor of Software Engineering Daily. And if you want to send 100,000 emails a month for free, go to pages.sparkpost.com/sedaily. Podcasting at least in 2017, is such an awesome hack for anybody who's looking for a way to access a better version of themselves, because it forces you to undergo this self-reflection. I think it's in this process of like listening back to the episodes you've done, whether you're editing or you're or you're actually just listening back to a finished episode, just doing that over and over and over again, and reflecting on both how you it's like it's almost like going back in time, and it's like that movie It's a Wonderful Life, where you're like stepping outside of the situation and you're observing it as a third person, and it makes you reflect on, oh, here is how things look from the third person, and I have all these problems, but I'm improving over time. And that's, there's something to that. And the caliber of people that are willing to interact with me is going up in terms of like the public status of those people. And it's like, that's cool. It's cool to see that measurable progress. So there's all these interesting and positive aspects of podcasting that are pretty cool.
Absolutely. There's one thing too that related to that is that a lot of the potential guests that I've reached out to saying, hey, do you want to be on the show? A lot of them have responded with, oh my gosh, you've had Udi Dahan on your show, right? You've had these huge names in the field, and I'm not worthy, right? I'm not of the caliber of these kinds of people. And, and some people are starting to see me in that light too, right? That almost like that I'm something beyond their level. And that's, I don't know, it's a lot of different mixed feelings that I have about that, because it's at the same time that I'm like, no way, right? That doesn't make any sense. I am one of you. It's also kind of rewarding to think that, you know what, there is something different about me, in that I decided that I wanted to do this podcast thing, and I took action and I did it. And, I was featured on John Sonmez's YouTube channel and podcast, The Simple Programmer, YouTube and podcast. I'm not sure whether to call that a podcast, since it's also a video channel, but that's another topic. But, I was on there just talking about taking action and what has resulted from doing Developer on Fire. And so, that was one of the things that he really emphasizes, is that there aren't that many people out there who just, decide to go for it.
Well, it's deterministic. If you're lucky enough to be in a scenario where you can spend your time like listening to podcasts, and you're you're a software developer, perhaps you live in America, you have all the right mix of things to deterministically turn your life into what you want it to be, which is a very lucky scenario to be in, and I think Developer on Fire is probably a channel where more and more people can realize that the potential.
Yeah, definitely.
So, I have discussions with people about why listeners tune into podcasts, and some people think that it's to learn. Some people think it's to feel less alone. I think there are all these fears about, or not fears, I think there are all these theories about why people, because people who listen, it's often like if you listen to podcasts, you listen to a ton of podcasts. People who are into podcasts are like voracious consumers of podcasts. Why is that? What are the main reasons that people are listening to podcasts?
So I listened to the episode of Software Engineering Daily where you were the guest and you were talking about that topic. And I think there's you've done some real research on this, and I think that idea of feeling less alone there's probably a lot to that. I can speak for myself, obviously for my motivations. Speaking generally about the broad public is largely conjecture, though I'm not afraid to conjecture. So I would say for myself, I love the audio medium because it goes with you everywhere and it's not demanding of your full attention. So I can do it while I'm doing something else. And multitasking is something that is mostly a myth in most of your life. But the ability to consume content while I'm walking home from having walked my kids to school, or being able to listen to a podcast while I'm driving, or any of these other low attention tasks. Now I can't listen to podcasts while I'm trying to write software. those things are not compatible. If I pay attention to one, I'm not paying attention to the other. But some other things that require less of your full attention, and I don't want to say that driving doesn't require your full attention, because it does, but there's something about the type of attention required that you can still have your mind listening to this other thing. It's why listening to the radio in the car works, and that was kind of the something that I really liked doing before listening to podcasts. But podcasts are a huge improvement over radio, because you don't start in the middle of the show and miss half of the thing. You don't have to, well, I guess in varying degrees, there's a lot less advertising that you have to deal with in when you're dealing with podcasts versus AM radio. I started listening to AM radio with sports, and I didn't do that. And then I started turning more into some of the politics and news and some of those things. But podcasting, right? It's so targeted, right? There's not if you want to listen to talk radio, that you have very limited options, and you don't get to listen to the show in its entirety. Right? With a podcast, I can listen to it as long as I am, not needing my attention or my hearing for something else, which is remarkable. And then as soon as I get to the end of that and I need to do something else, well, I just stop it where it is. And then the next time I have some freedom to be able to consume that content, then it just continues from there. And it's a beautiful thing, right? The subscription model is absolutely perfect for the type of content that I like to consume. It also gives me the ability to, I can listen to software podcasts. I can listen to philosophy podcasts. I can listen to health and wellness and self-optimization, productivity, all sorts of things that really spin my gears. So me as a podcast consumer, I just love the ability to multitask consuming content with something else. And in addition, hearing someone's voice, I think, is a level of intimacy that goes beyond text. And I think that's really one of the big draws, one of the big reasons that people start to really become fans of podcast hosts, and why I've had people ask me to take a picture with them and some of those things, right? Because you really feel like you know somebody when they're in your ear, as much as we podcasters are for our listeners. So I think the intimacy of really a human connection, I think, is related to that thing about not feeling so alone. Those are some of the things that I think are really appealing about the medium of audio.
Completely agree. I've heard that term described as asymmetric intimacy, because the listener feels like they know the podcaster, but the podcaster, we don't have intimate understanding of who you are. So, but I mean, I'm sure you get emails from people that are like, hey, this podcast has been super important to me. And then it becomes more of a symmetrically intimate.
There's also that I think you have a Slack group around the podcast, and I have a Facebook group for that as well. And I think that's a neat chance for people to go and to interact a little bit and to close that gap a little bit, right? I mean, there's still going to be a big difference a big asymmetry in the nature of the relationship there. But I think that's one chance for interaction. And I think comments on show notes pages too is something that is way underused. And I think a lot more people should be engaging that way. In fact, that was one of the ways that I really started on the thing. I've told the story, that reference to me being on Simple Programmer with John Sonmez. I told the story there about how John's package, How to Market Yourself as a Software Developer, was something that I bought. And Pinal Dave, who is the blogger at SQLauthority.com, which is millions of page views, every month, and he blogs daily. Pinal basically issued a challenge in there that said, if you're serious about blogging, come and comment on my blog every day for 7 days. And he's only had a handful of takers on that challenge. And so I think that's one of the things there, right? That getting engaged in the community, in some of these things that are going on, is a huge way to move yourself forward. And it was my taking Pinal's challenge that, and commenting on his blog, commenting on John Sonmez's blog, and commenting on the .NET Rocks show notes pages, that really catapulted me into thinking, I've got something to offer, that my comments on these blogs are rewarding and worth my time and worth my effort. And well, I can take that the next step and do some blog writing. And ultimately that led into podcasting. So I think that's a relevant piece too, is that, yes, there is an asymmetric relationship in this podcast thing, but there are some ways to close that gap a little bit too and get engaged.
You've written in detail about the idea of fear. Why are you interested in the topic of fear?
Well, I think it's something that has held me back significantly. I think for years, right, a majority of my software career, I've gone to user group meetings, sat in the back of the room, and thought, I could give a presentation on this topic. It would be pretty good. It might be better than the one that the people are seeing here, right? I've got something to offer. And then
And when did that change? What was the inflection point of where you stopped being scared?
Well, I don't think, when did I stop being scared? Probably 20 or 30 episodes into the podcast is when I stopped being scared about it. When I made the inflection that despite being scared, I'm going to go ahead and engage and see what happens. That was really inspired by John Sonmez's How to Market Yourself as a Software Developer package, as I mentioned, especially the Pinal Dave interview in there. So, and that's it's a few $100s for that package, well worth it. And so, that's something that I would direct people to that when asked about, something really important for this. So, but yeah, fear. I felt like I had something to offer. I felt like I was exceptional in some way and that getting engaged would benefit myself and the community, but I didn't do it. And that was largely because I think the fear is not only the fear of making yourself look like a fool, right? And that's certainly present. But the thought in my mind that I do have something to offer, well, if I put the effort into sharing that and I find out that it's not actually valuable for other people, well, I don't know if I could take that kind of rejection, right? That I think that's the real fear, right? Going back to George McFly, that my best is not good enough. And I think asking that question, right? Here is the thing that I've really put my effort into. I've really given this my all to try to make it something valuable for you. And then to find out that it's not there, that's the thing that really causes me fear. But at the same time, ultimately, I think we have to get over that, because if you don't find out, you're never going to know, right? If you don't actually take the shot, you just don't know. So I think for a lot of us, having a 9-to-5 job, going and writing software and going home, have a beer, watch the game, that kind of a lifestyle, that's good enough, right? That's exactly what a lot of us want, and more power to you if that's what you want. It's not what I wanted. I wanted to be engaged. I wanted to be sharing. I wanted to find out if I really had something to offer that was worth listening to. And if you do have that desire and you are not going for it because of fear, well, I think you're missing out on a big part of the experience of life. And that's how I've lived a majority of my life. And now that I'm seeing the other side of that and the rewards of putting something out there and really trying to go for it, I think it's incomparable, the quality of life that you get from that.
Yeah, my favorite book about fear is The Icarus Deception, which is a book by Seth Godin. And the core focus of that book is this idea that many of us, particularly those who are lucky enough to live in the United States or some other part of the developed world, and we have access to a computer and all of the trappings that come with that source of infinite information, we're scared of flying too close to the sun. Like, none of us, and that's what the reference to Icarus, who flew too close to the sun, when in reality, the greater risk is that we might end up doing too little and flying too close to the ocean. So that's the deception, is we think that how dare we be so ambitious as to think that we could aspire to something greater than to come home and drink a beer and watch the game and forget about those ideas about side projects or starting a podcast or whatever. Like, how dare we think about that? We should not fly closer to the sun. But in reality, the greater problem is that too many people just fly too close to the ocean, and we don't make progress as humanity as fast as we would otherwise. Why is it that so many of us have this fear regulation part of our brain that is wired to be irrationally afraid rather than to err on the side of boldness?
That's a good question. I have some thoughts on that. Before I get into that, I just want to say that I've read blog posts by Seth Godin, but never that book or really any book that he's written, and that's absolutely beautiful, right? The allusion to mythology there really illustrates the point really well, and I'm impressed by that. That's really cool. I think I'd say it's probably evolutionary, right? I think throughout much of early human history, and really human history itself, through the majority of human history, we're a tribal kind of creature, right? Your survival depended on being a part of your tribe, and the rejection of the tribe really called into question your ability to survive. So this putting yourself out there in front of people, offering something, and ultimately, facing the fact that you could be rejected with your best effort, well, that calls into something very primal in us, a very, not only a fear of just the embarrassment of that, but that, in our biology, it feels like a potential for, calling your survival into question. So even though it's in today's age, that's not really applicable, and that's not the reality that we face, I think that's still a large part of the hardwired programming that we have, that is probably inescapable, just an evolutionary artifact of our past. So I think that's probably a big part of why we tend to do that. In addition, I think about the way that we raise our children and the way that we interact with society. When I left a job at a behemoth, a telecom company, to go work for a much smaller company, my dad, who worked in the same job for 40 years, he just looked at me and he was like, well, why would you do that, right? Why would you give up that stability? And, I think it's societal as well, right? The idea that you shouldn't take chances, you shouldn't rock the boat, I think is something that it keeps us safe, right? And evolution favors safe in a lot of ways. So I think, it really kind of comes back to that evolutionary trend that, we are programmed towards safety, even though the rewards are so much greater by taking some risk. And if you don't take some risk, you're really cutting yourself off from some of the great rewards that life has to offer.
Yeah, and I think that the way to overcome that fear, for me at least, has been working on these side projects, and then things like Software Engineering Daily, and really taking them seriously. And I think that is, I think there are a lot of people listening who probably have these things, side projects, and even the name side project, this is just a thing on the side. I think people could benefit by taking their own side projects more seriously and approaching them with conviction that they'll work out eventually. And I think that's something I hear kind of reflected in some of the things you're saying, as particularly about Developer on Fire and your consistency of approach to it. And even though it took you 30 episodes to kind of have that fear inflection, you kept at it. So
Yeah, both you and Jonathan Cottrell from Developer T, I've heard both of you guys say that when you started the podcast, you just treated it like a business from the get-go.
Yeah.
That was the emphasis, and that was not what I did, right? I mean, Developer on Fire for me was much more of a side project, much more of a, well, I'm going to try this audio thing and see how it goes, and we'll see where it goes. So, I didn't take a very, not necessarily that it wasn't a serious approach, because it was something that really was important to me. And maybe that's a part of why it has caught on, is that it was just a side project, but it wasn't just a side project, if that makes any sense, right? That doesn't sound very sensical, but there was I think I did take it very seriously, and it mattered to me, and especially early on I just did some interviews, and I wanted to have a few in the bucket before I published any of them. But then after I made the feed public and it was out there, I wanted to stick to a schedule. And so I made it a commitment that I was going to, in the beginning it was 2 a week, ultimately went up to 3 a week. And then when the tweets started coming in saying, hey, I can't listen to all these, I took it back down to 2 a week. But, I think that I did have a commitment to it, even though I didn't have that same approach that you and Jonathan did.
So let's begin to wrap up. Where are you going to take the Developer on Fire platform? Are you focused on the podcast and improving that, or would you like to evolve it significantly beyond that?
I think I do have ambitions to want to do more. So when I started Developer on Fire, I was blogging on a different domain, and I've really just recently kind of merged those together. So now my blog is on Developer on Fire as well, and I'd like to, I think, eventually turn that into a community, right? Get some guest bloggers and some of those things. So I do want to grow Developer on Fire as a source of content in various forms, and just making it a valuable resource for the community. I think of John Sonmez with Simple Programmer, right? The thing that he's done, and turn that into a place where there's so much there about both technical and non-technical, right? The soft skills, life instruction, all of those kinds of things. I'd like for Developer on Fire to become something along those lines, right? I mean, with some obvious divergence from that, the podcast, I think, is still going to be, for the foreseeable future, and probably even beyond foreseeable, it's going to be the centerpiece of what Developer on Fire is all about. I mean, it is the genesis, and it is kind of the bedrock of what Developer on Fire is. But yeah, I'd like to do more with Developer on Fire.
Very cool. Well, Dave, it's been great talking to you. I am a fan of Developer on Fire. I think it's an awesome podcast, and I learn a lot from it. Just thinking about what aspects of the human condition of the developer I should bleed into discussing on Software Engineering Daily. Like I noticed that when I'm listening to Developer on Fire, I'm consistently entertained. And sometimes when I'm listening to my own podcast, Software Engineering Daily, there will be episodes where I'm like, okay, this is really useful information, and it's too informative. It's like I'm in class or something. And so anyway, I think there's some trade-off to be made there between how entertaining and how human a show is versus how it's just raw information. It makes it easier to digest, and I think that's something I've really learned from you. So thanks.
Well, I think every show has its own aspects, right? Just like you can't be an expert in every programming language, right? You can't have any one podcast that's going to cover the whole gamut. And I think it's great that we can have these different shows that have different emphases.
Great. Okay. Well, thanks for coming on Software Engineering Daily, Dave.
Absolutely, Jeff. Thank you very much.
Software Engineering Radio is the podcast where I learned how to make high-quality content. I have been a part-time host on SE Radio for 4 years, and it has been a fantastic learning experience and community. SE Radio is currently looking for volunteer hosts, and if you're interested in learning how to podcast about software engineering, contact Robert Blumen, the editor of Software Engineering Radio. His email is robert@robertblumen.com, BLUMEN. On that note, Software Engineering Daily is also looking for new hosts, and you can email me, jeff@softwareengineeringdaily.com, if you are interested. Podcasting about software engineering is a great way to build a stronger understanding of technical topics, whether you are early in your career or later on in your career. If you're interested in Software Engineering Radio, I encourage you to email robert@robertblumen.com to learn about Software Engineering Radio. And if you're interested in Software Engineering Daily, email me, jeff@softwareengineeringdaily.com. Thanks for listening.